I was halfway through washing my RV in my own driveway when I saw her marching up the sidewalk. Karren Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. With her perfectly ironed blouse, clipboard in hand, and that ever-present look of disapproval, she was on a mission. I sighed. Here we go again. "Zane, we have discussed this before," she announced, stopping at the edge of my driveway like it was a battlefield line she refused to cross. "Large vehicles like this are not allowed in driveways. It's an eyesore to the community." I turned off the hose and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Karren, this is my property. My RV is parked entirely within my driveway. I'm not blocking the road and I'm not breaking any city ordinances." She flipped through her clipboard as if looking for some obscure rule. "It's against HOA regulations. You need to remove it immediately or I will have it towed." I raised an eyebrow. "You will have it towed from my own property?" She lifted her chin, smug as ever. "Yes. If you don't move it by tomorrow morning, I'll call the towing company myself." I almost laughed. Almost. Because what Karren didn't know, what she never bothered to find out, was that I owned the towing company she was about to call. But I wasn't going to tell her that just yet. No, I wanted to see how far she would take this ridiculous power trip. "All right, Karren," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You do what you have to do." Her lips curled in satisfaction. "Good. Finally, some compliance. I'll check in tomorrow morning. If it's still here, it's getting towed." She turned and strutted away, victorious. I smiled to myself. This was going to be fun. The next morning, I made sure to park myself on my front porch with a fresh cup of coffee, waiting for the inevitable. The sun had barely started climbing the sky when Karren appeared, marching down the sidewalk with an air of absolute authority. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 other board members trailed behind her: Martin, an overly eager rule enforcer, and Brenda, who mostly just nodded along with whatever Karren said. I watched as they stopped at the foot of my driveway, their eyes locked onto the RV like it was some kind of neighborhood plague. Karren pulled out her phone, her expression triumphant. Without acknowledging me, she made the call. I could barely contain myself when I heard my office line ringing from my pocket. I let it go to voicemail, knowing my dispatcher would handle it. The woman on the other end, Lisa, had been working for me for years. She knew exactly how to play along. Karren snapped her phone shut and folded her arms. "The tow truck will be here shortly," she announced, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "I told you yesterday, Zane, you had your chance to comply." I took a slow sip of my coffee, steadying my expression. "Guess we'll see how that works out for you." Martin, always eager to impress Karren, cleared his throat. "You should really move it before they get here. It'll cost you a fortune to get it back from impound." Brenda just nodded, as if her presence was enough to reinforce their authority. I leaned against the porch railing, perfectly at ease. I'll take my chances. Less than 10 minutes later, the familiar rumble of a diesel engine echoed down the street. My tow truck appeared at the end of the block, its polished chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The company logo, my company logo, was emblazoned on the side, clear as day. The truck pulled up, and my driver, Mike, stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses as he took in the scene. He spotted me immediately and gave a small nod, but kept his face neutral. Karren, oblivious, strode toward him with the confidence of someone who thought she had already won. "Finally," she huffed. "That eyesore needs to go. Tow it immediately." Mike glanced at the RV, then at me, then back at Karren. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "You sure about that?" Karren scoffed. "Of course I'm sure. This vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations, and I called your company to remove it." Mike turned to me, barely containing his amusement. "Boss, you want me to tow your own RV?" Karren's entire demeanor shifted. Confusion flickered across her face as she processed his words. Then, realization hit like a freight train. Her head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing. What did he just call you? I set my coffee down and stood up, stretching slightly before stepping off the porch. Oh, that's right, I don't think I ever mentioned it. I own this towing company. Karren's jaw clenched so tightly, I thought she might crack a tooth. Martin looked like he wanted to sink into the ground, and Brenda, for the first time, appeared to be reevaluating her life choices. Mike, still playing along, gestured toward the RV. So what do you want me to do, boss? Should I tow it, or maybe? He glanced meaningfully at Karren. Something else. I let the moment hang, enjoying the discomfort radiating from the HOA trio. Then, I turned back to Karren. You tried to tow my property from my own driveway without legal grounds. That's attempted theft, and since my company was the one called out, I have direct evidence of your overreach, Karren bristled. This is completely out of line. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen a few times. Actually, I'd say it's completely within line. In fact, I think I'll be filing an official complaint with the city about the HOA abusing power. Martin, who had been silent up until now, suddenly found his voice. There's no need to escalate things, Zane. Maybe we can work something out. I tilted my head. You mean like how you all could have just left me alone in the first place? Brenda, sensing that this was not going in their favor, finally spoke up. Karren, maybe we should, but Karren wasn't ready to back down. This isn't over, she hissed. The HOA has authority over this community, and we will take the necessary steps to ensure compliance. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, I fully expect you to try. But next time, maybe make sure you're not calling a tow company owned by the person you're trying to mess with. With that, I nodded at Mike, who gave me a knowing grin before climbing back into the truck. The diesel engine roared to life as he pulled away, leaving behind a stunned silence. Karren, still seething, turned on her heel and stormed off. Martin followed, clearly regretting his involvement. Brenda hesitated, then gave me a small nod before trailing after them. I exhaled, shaking my head. This was far from over. Karren wasn't the type to let something like this go without trying to regain control. Which meant I needed to be ready for whatever ridiculous stunt she pulled next. I didn't have to wait long for Karren's next move. The very next day, I got a notice taped to my front door, a formal HOA violation. The paper was neatly typed, complete with the official HOA letterhead, and it demanded that I remove my RV within 24 hours or face escalating fines. I read through the document carefully. The wording was aggressive, clearly meant to intimidate, but it lacked any actual legal foundation. HOA rules did not override city ordinances, and my RV was fully within the legal limits of my property. Still, this wasn't just about a single violation anymore. Karren was making it personal. I decided it was time to get ahead of whatever she had planned next. I hopped in my truck and headed straight to City Hall. If Karren wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure I had every legal document and piece of evidence on my side. An hour later, I walked out with copies of zoning laws, city parking regulations, and property rights statutes. I even had a written statement from the city clerk confirming that my RV was not in violation of any municipal code. By the time I got back home, I wasn't surprised to see Martin lurking near my driveway, clipboard in hand. He glanced up when I pulled in, shifting uneasily as if he wasn't sure whether to stand his ground or retreat. I stepped out of my truck and walked straight past him to my door, completely ignoring his presence. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Instead of acknowledging him immediately, I took my time unlocking my door, setting my papers down inside, and then finally turning around. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Martin hesitated before speaking. He was clearly less confident without Karren by his side. He finally muttered that they were just enforcing the rules, as if that would somehow justify what they were doing. He barely met my gaze, shifting from foot to foot like he wanted to be anywhere else. I told him flatly that I had already checked city regulations and that my RV was not breaking any laws. I even offered to show him the documents, but he shook his head, mumbling that he was just doing what the board had decided. I asked him if he really thought it was a good idea to push this, especially after what had happened the day before. He had no answer for that, just gave a half-hearted shrug and muttered that he was only following instructions. Instead of pressing him further, I simply told him that if the HOA wanted to continue harassing me, I would be more than happy to take legal action. His face paled slightly at that, and without another word, he turned and hurried back down the sidewalk. I closed my door, knowing full well that this wasn't over. Karren wasn't the type to back down after a single failed attempt. If anything, this was just the beginning. The next morning, I was greeted with yet another escalation. This time, it wasn't just a fine notice, it was a formal letter stating that the HOA was considering legal action against me for non-compliance. That was when I decided to take things a step further. I reached out to a lawyer. I knew someone who had experience dealing with overreaching HOAs. After reviewing my case, he assured me that I was completely within my rights and that the HOA had no legal standing to enforce their so-called violations. But I didn't stop there. I started talking to my neighbors, asking if they had experienced similar harassment from the HOA. It didn't take long for the stories to start pouring in. Fines for minor landscaping decisions, threats over mailbox colors, even attempts to force people to pay for unnecessary community upgrades. It was worse than I had thought. By the end of the week, I had gathered enough testimonies to paint a clear picture. Karren and her board weren't just enforcing rules, they were using them to control and intimidate homeowners. I compiled every complaint, every documented instance of overreach, and every city ordinance they had ignored. Then, I sent it all to the local news. It didn't take long for a reporter to take interest. The day the story aired, I made sure to be outside, casually working on my RV as the news segment played on my phone. Not even an hour later, Karren came storming down the street. This time, she wasn't smug, she was furious. She demanded to know if I was responsible for the slanderous lies being spread about the HOA. I calmly informed her that everything in the report was backed by documentation and testimonies from actual residents. She tried to threaten legal action, but I simply handed her my lawyer's card and told her to direct any further complaints to him. For the first time since this whole mess started, she had nothing to say. She stormed off without another word, leaving me standing there, watching as her little empire started to crumble. This wasn't over yet, but it was clear that the tide was turning. After the news segment aired, the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had been too afraid to speak out before were suddenly emboldened. I started getting nods of approval from neighbors who had previously kept their distance, and a few even stopped by to thank me for exposing the HOA's overreach. Karren, however, wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had spent years ruling over this neighborhood with an iron grip, and she wasn't about to let a single setback destroy her control. Her next move came swiftly. Early the next morning, I woke up to find a bright red notice taped to my front door. This time, it wasn't just another fine or empty threat. It was a formal declaration from the HOA board stating that my property was now under review for a series of infractions that, if not corrected, could lead to a lien being placed on my home. I scanned the document, shaking my head. The list of so-called violations was laughable. Peeling paint on my fence, overgrown grass on the edges of my driveway, and the most ridiculous one of all, unauthorized commercial activity. They were trying to claim that because I owned a towing company, I was running a business out of my home. I let out a slow breath, resisting the urge to crumple the paper right then and there. Karren had clearly lost the public's trust after the news piece, so now she was going straight for financial pressure. If she couldn't scare me into backing down, she was going to try and bleed me dry. I wasn't going to let that happen. Instead of reacting with anger, I took my time preparing my next move. I called my lawyer, making sure he was fully updated on the HOA's latest stunt. Then I reached out to a few neighbors who had also been targeted with similar bogus violations in the past. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered enough evidence to take things to the next level. I filed a formal complaint with the city, backed by documentation proving that the HOA was fabricating violations to justify financial penalties. I also contacted the county recorder's office to preemptively block any attempt to place an illegal lien on my property. By the time I was done, Karren's latest power play was already falling apart. The next board meeting was set for that evening, and I made sure to attend. Normally, HOA meetings were quiet affairs with only a handful of residents showing up, but tonight the room was packed. The news report had sparked something in the community, and people wanted answers. Karren was seated at the front of the room, flanked by Martin and Brenda. She looked calm, but there was a tightness in her posture that betrayed her frustration. I took a seat near the front, making sure she saw me. The meeting started with routine business, but it didn't take long before the real issue was brought up. A resident stood and demanded an explanation for the bogus violations. Another followed, asking why the HOA was threatening liens without proper cause. Karren tried to regain control, insisting that these actions were necessary to maintain property values, but the room wasn't buying it. That was when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Instead, I simply laid out the facts. I explained how the HOA had attempted to tow my legally parked RV, how they had fabricated violations after their first attempt failed, and how they were now trying to use financial pressure to retaliate. I presented the legal documents I had gathered, showing that their actions not only violated city ordinances, but could also be considered fraudulent under state law. By the time I was done, the room was dead silent. Then someone in the back spoke up, asking the question that was on everyone's mind. What happens if we refuse to pay these fines? I turned to Karren, waiting for her response. She clenched her jaw before finally speaking. She claimed that failure to comply would result in further penalties, but there was a noticeable hesitation in her voice now. I didn't let up. I informed the room that I had already contacted a lawyer, and that anyone who had been unfairly fined should do the same. I also pointed out that if enough residents pushed back, the HOA wouldn't have the funds or legal standing to enforce their bogus claims. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were starting to realize that they weren't powerless. Karren's face hardened as she realized she was losing control. She tried to move on to another topic, but the room wasn't having it. More residents stood up, demanding answers, questioning past fines, and calling for an audit of the HOA's finances. Brenda, who had been silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Martin looked downright panicked. Then the final blow came. A man near the back of the room stood up and calmly stated that he had already reached out to the state's HOA regulatory board to file a formal complaint against the leadership. He had documentation of financial discrepancies, unexplained fees, and misused funds. Karren's hands gripped the edges of the table, her face paling. The meeting quickly spiraled out of her control. Residents were calling for a vote to remove the board entirely. Others were demanding an independent audit. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that Karren's grip on the community was slipping. I watched as she struggled to regain her composure, but the damage was done. By the time the meeting ended, she looked like a woman who knew her reign was coming to an end. As I walked out of the meeting, several neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing up to the HOA. Some even offered to help with gathering more evidence to ensure the board was held accountable. I nodded, knowing that this fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, the HOA wasn't the one holding the power, and Karren knew it. The aftermath of the meeting sent ripples through the neighborhood. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors now spilled onto sidewalks and driveways. People who had spent years grumbling about the HOA's heavy-handed control were suddenly emboldened, realizing they weren't alone in their frustrations. Karren, however, was far from finished. Her desperation became evident the next morning when I found two uniformed code enforcement officers standing at my property line, speaking in hushed tones while inspecting my RV. One of them held a clipboard, flipping through papers while the other took pictures. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The sound made both officers glance up. They exchanged a look before the one with the clipboard cleared his throat. He had the kind of cautious demeanor that suggested he was used to dealing with angry homeowners. Before he could launch into whatever script he had prepared, I cut straight to the point. I asked them what they were doing on my property. The officer hesitated before explaining that a complaint had been filed about my RV violating municipal codes. He gestured to the clipboard, stating that they were investigating a potential infraction regarding oversized vehicle storage. I took a slow breath, keeping my expression neutral. I asked him if he had verified the complaint against city ordinances before coming out. He hesitated again, then admitted that they were following up on a report but hadn't reviewed the exact wording of the ordinance before arriving. That was all I needed to hear. I stepped back inside, grabbed the official zoning documents I had picked up from City Hall, and handed them over. I told them to read the section that explicitly allowed residential driveways to accommodate vehicles under a certain length, which my RV fell well within. The officer with the clipboard scanned the document, his brow furrowing as he read. His partner leaned over to look as well, their expressions shifting from neutral professionalism to mild annoyance. I pointed out that whoever had filed the complaint either didn't understand the law or was deliberately trying to misuse city resources to harass a legal property owner. The officers exchanged another glance before the one with the clipboard sighed, muttering that this wasn't the first time they had been called out to deal with an HOA dispute. He apologized for the inconvenience and assured me that no further action would be taken. As they walked back to their vehicle, one of them glanced toward the HOA's community office down the street and shook his head. I watched them leave before heading back inside. Karren had clearly thought she could weaponize city enforcement against me, but once again, she had underestimated my willingness to fight back with facts and documentation. Later that evening, I saw Martin pacing outside his house, phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, and he kept glancing toward the HOA office as he spoke. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't a pleasant one. Brenda, on the other hand, had gone completely silent. I hadn't seen her since the meeting, and word around the neighborhood was that she was considering stepping down from the board entirely. Karren, however, was still holding on, though her grip was visibly slipping. Her next move came in the form of a community-wide email that landed in my inbox the following morning. It was a long-winded attempt to reassert her authority, filled with thinly veiled threats about consequences for continued noncompliance, and a desperate plea to restore order and decorum to the neighborhood. The best part? The email included a new proposal for increased HOA fines, claiming that they needed additional funds to maintain enforcement efforts. That was the final straw for many residents. By the end of the week, a petition had begun circulating calling for a full audit of the HOA's finances. Dozens of signatures appeared overnight, including some from homeowners who had previously supported Karren's leadership. At the same time, a group of neighbors started organizing a recall vote. They had seen enough, and they were ready to strip the board of its power. Karren must have sensed the walls closing in because, for the first time since this all began, she actually showed up at my house. When I opened the door, she was standing stiffly on my porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced with something closer to controlled panic. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she launched straight into a speech about how my actions were damaging the community and how I had stirred up unnecessary discord. I let her talk, arms crossed, waiting for her to get to the point. Eventually, she admitted that she was willing to reconsider the violations against my RV if I would support keeping the current HOA board intact. I stared at her for a long moment before asking if she seriously thought I would agree to that. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I told her flatly that this wasn't just about my RV anymore. This was about years of overreach, intimidation, and financial exploitation. The residents had spoken, and they weren't going to be bullied back into submission. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized I wasn't going to budge. She straightened, lifting her chin in one last attempt at maintaining control, then turned sharply and walked away without another word. 2 weeks later, the recall vote was held. The result: a resounding victory for the homeowners. Karren, Martin, and the remaining board members were officially removed from their positions. A new board was elected, one that prioritized transparency and fairness over arbitrary control. As for Karren, she put her house up for sale not long after. Without her position of power, she had nothing left to hold on to. The HOA didn't disappear entirely, but under new leadership, it became what it was supposed to be: a group dedicated to maintaining shared spaces, not controlling private property. And my RV. It stayed exactly where it belonged in my driveway, untouched and untowed. With Karren gone and the HOA under new leadership, the neighborhood felt different. People who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and constant harassment now walked their streets with a newfound sense of freedom. Front yards were no longer meticulously policed, minor changes to homes went unchallenged, and the heavy presence of unnecessary enforcement had vanished almost overnight. But the scars of Karren's reign didn't disappear immediately. The new HOA board, led by a no-nonsense retired firefighter named Greg, had inherited a mess. The financial audit revealed years of mismanaged funds, including thousands of dollars in unexplained administrative expenses that had mysteriously disappeared under Karren's leadership. The neighborhood's reserve funds were nearly depleted, and several community projects that residents had paid for had never been completed. Greg wasted no time in calling a town hall meeting, making it clear that transparency would now be the priority. Unlike the rigid, control-obsessed meetings under Karren, this one was open and honest. Homeowners were given a full breakdown of the financial situation, and Greg didn't sugarcoat anything. The HOA was in bad shape, but with proper management, it could be salvaged. A few residents asked if legal action could be taken against Karren for the missing funds, but Greg explained that without concrete proof of theft, it would be nearly impossible to pursue. However, he did have a plan to prevent something like this from ever happening again. A new bylaw was proposed requiring all financial decisions to be approved by a homeowner-led review committee, not just the board. It passed unanimously. For the first time in years, the HOA was actually working for the people instead of against them. As for me, I was enjoying my newfound peace. My RV remained untouched in my driveway, and I no longer had to deal with bogus fines or surprise visits from city inspectors. The neighborhood had changed for the better, and I was content to finally move on from the whole ordeal. But Karren's departure didn't mean she had disappeared completely. One afternoon, while working on my truck, I spotted a familiar figure at the end of the block. Karren, dressed in a sharp business suit, stood near the sidewalk, speaking with a man I didn't recognize. She gestured toward the houses, her expression unreadable. Curious, I casually walked toward a neighbor's yard, pretending to check something near the fence while keeping an ear on the conversation. The man nodded as Karren spoke, glancing down at a folder he held. He flipped through a few pages before responding. Though I couldn't catch every word, I heard enough to piece it together. Karren was trying to sell her house, but there was a problem. The news report exposing the HOA's corruption had made its way to real estate listings, and potential buyers were wary. Homes in the neighborhood were still valuable, but the stigma of Karren's leadership had tainted her property's appeal. Any buyer who did their research would find the articles detailing her abuses of power, and it wasn't helping her case. The man, likely a real estate agent, appeared to be explaining exactly that. Karren's posture stiffened, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She said something in a clipped tone before turning sharply on her heel and marching back toward her house. I couldn't help but shake my head. Even after everything, she still believed she was untouchable. Reality, however, had a way of catching up. A few weeks passed, and Karren's house remained on the market with no serious offers. Rumors spread that she had tried lowering the price multiple times, but even then, buyers weren't biting. Eventually, a for rent sign appeared in her yard. Unable to sell, she had resorted to leasing the property instead, but even that didn't go as planned. The new tenants, a young couple with 2 large dogs and an affinity for weekend barbecues, weren't the quiet, rule-abiding types Karren would have preferred. They hosted gatherings, played music in their backyard, and much to my amusement parked their oversized truck right in the driveway, partially blocking the sidewalk. It was the kind of small rebellion that Karren would have fined them for in an instant, but she was no longer in charge. One evening, as I was locking up my garage, I spotted her standing outside her house, arms crossed, watching her tenants with barely concealed frustration. The couple was grilling in the backyard, laughing with friends as the scent of barbecue filled the air. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no more smug superiority, no more veiled threats. Just quiet bitterness. She turned away first, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. It was fitting. After years of controlling others, she was now trapped in a situation she couldn't dictate. The HOA had moved on. The neighborhood had moved on, and I had moved on. As I walked back to my house, the sound of laughter and music from next door filling the air, I couldn't help but smile. Justice, as it turned out, didn't always come in the form of legal battles or dramatic showdowns. Sometimes, it came in the simple satisfaction of knowing that the person who once made life miserable was now powerless to do anything about it.